Most of us take our senses for granted. We rarely question whether what we are seeing and hearing is an accurate record of the world around us. But some people experience things differently. They may see, hear, or feel things that are not real, hallucinations, or be washed over by a wave of different senses all at the same time. Hearing colours, seeing music, feeling words. This is known as synaesthesia. I'm Professor Graeme Yorston, and I'm exploring the world of Victor Kandinsky, a pioneering Russian psychiatrist who wrote extensively about the subjective experience of mental imagery and hallucinations, work that is still important today in our understanding of how the brain perceives the world. His more famous cousin, Vasily Kandinsky, was a trailblazer of abstract art and someone who experienced synaesthesia, seeing bright colours when listening to music and hearing hissing sounds and symphonic music when painting. Whereas Wassily explored the nature of his experiences through art, Victor devoted his life to studying and treating people with mental illness. His detailed descriptions of the nature of experience anticipate the approach of 20th century psychiatrists in emphasizing the importance of the form of mental imagery over its content in reaching diagnoses. But his research was more than just an academic exercise to be soon forgotten on a dusty library shelf. It was personal, as he himself had suffered from bouts of severe mental illness from his 20s onwards. And he died by his own hand when he felt a relapse coming on at the age of 40. But before I start, I must say a big thank you to Dr. Elena Samarodova of Lomonosov Moscow State University for her assistance in researching this video. Kandinsky was born in 1849 during the reign of Tsar Nicholas I, considered by many to have been more intent on expanding his empire and suppressing dissent than the welfare of his people. His father was a wealthy, if slightly dodgy, fur trader, and he spent his childhood in a remote village in Siberia, 4,000 miles or 6,500 kilometers from Moscow, at a time when the borders between the Russian Empire and the Qing dynasty of China were still being actively disputed. When he was 14 years old, he made the long journey to Moscow to attend school. He excelled and won a place at the Moscow Imperial University Medical School. Unfortunately, his father's rather dubious business empire collapsed, drying up his income, and he had to survive on a diet of bread and kvass, or sweet beer, before graduating in 1872. In his first few years as a doctor, he practiced general medicine in a Moscow hospital. But he had an inquiring mind and wrote over 30 papers, both original research and reviews of the latest advances in the rest of Europe. His interests were wide-ranging, including the philosophy and psychology of medicine, public health, including a review of how to burn the dead, and he published 3 papers on psychiatric issues. He was fluent in several languages, and his papers demonstrate a thorough understanding of the works of the leading French and German psychiatrists. In 1876, he was called up to serve in the Russian Navy at the Nikolaev Naval Base on the Black Sea, in what is now Ukraine. At first, he was shore-based, but when tensions between Russia and Turkey broke out into a full-scale and brutal war, characterized by widespread atrocities and ethnic cleansing on both sides, he was ordered aboard the torpedo boat tender Grand Duke Constantine, under the command of Admiral Makarov. This was the first vessel of its type in the world, but after its successful deployment and the destruction of a Turkish ship in the Bosphorus by torpedo, it had a less successful engagement off Batumi in modern-day Georgia, in which 2 of the smaller boats were lost. Overwhelmed, Kandinsky jumped into the sea with the intention of taking his own life. Letters preserved in the archives suggest he had been suffering from severe depressive symptoms for several months prior to this, with apathy, a sense of hopelessness, and eating so little that he became anemic. He also developed delusions, intrusive thoughts, and vivid hallucinations, such that he found it difficult to tell whether he was awake or dreaming. Fortunately, he was plucked from the waves and admitted to a naval asylum, where he remained for almost a year, convinced that his hallucinations were communicated by some kind of electrical induction from the minds of the other patients around him. He identified the roots of his melancholic state as mental fatigue from working at night, the change in living conditions enforced by war, and alcohol, not excessive by military standards, but too much for him. He slowly improved and gained insight, helped by one of his nurses, Elizaveta Karlovna Freimuth, the daughter of a German pharmacist, with whom he fell in love. After he was discharged, they married and spent the next 6 months abroad on an extended honeymoon. But he was not yet fully recovered and suffered exacerbations of his hallucinations and other psychotic symptoms. In 1878, the couple returned to Russia, where his mental state deteriorated again, and he had to be admitted to a small private psychiatric hospital, now an addiction treatment clinic, situated on an island across the river from the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, run by Dr. Alexander Frey, known for his caring and humane approach. In 1880, Kandinsky published his first work on hallucinations. This is his German version of it, based on a detailed description of his own symptoms. He had visual, olfactory, i.e. smell, and auditory hallucinations, affecting all of his senses except taste. He wrote, "Some of my hallucinations were vivid and diversified with the bright colours of the real objects of ordinary vision. There were hallucinations with my eyes open and my eyes closed. In time, I became so accustomed to them that they ceased to excite or overwhelm me, and eventually they simply amused me." He also wrote that it was difficult to distinguish auditory hallucinations from real sounds because in an asylum there were so many voices and strange noises coming from everywhere, it was hard to tell what was real and what imagined. He also experienced more unusual hallucinations of touch and pressure, as well as altered perceptions of balance and the position of his body in space, such that objects seemed to revolve around his body. "The floor seemed to fly under my feet, the walls fly or split in two. Sometimes with my right eye I noticed that one part of the wall is moving up, whilst the left eye registered that part of it is moving down." His experience of being a patient made him want to become a psychiatrist, and he spent the next 8 years working at St. Nicholas the Miraculous Hospital in St. Petersburg, still one of the city's main psychiatric institutions, where he was known for his inexhaustible dedication to his patients and the amount of time he spent talking to them to try and understand and record their symptoms in minute detail. He observed from his own experience that when he was concentrating hard on something, reading or intellectual work for example, his hallucinations faded, even disappeared completely for a while, until he focused attention on them again. This led him to develop a therapeutic method for his patients to alleviate their hallucinations by training them to focus their attention on something else, which is one of the psychological approaches to treating psychosis that we still use today. His psychiatrist diagnosed him with melancholia, which equates most closely to a modern diagnosis of major depression. But Kandinsky diagnosed himself with the German term Primäre Verrücktheit, or primary paranoid psychosis, which was a newly introduced concept by Emil Kraepelin, which eventually evolved into dementia praecox, which in turn evolved into schizophrenia. After 4 years of being completely well and working hard, Kandinsky suffered another psychotic episode in 1883, preceded, as before, by months of severe depression which he tried to treat with opium and cannabis extract. He had a short hospital admission, and although discharged only partially recovered, he was able to continue working and carrying out his research, gaining recognition both inside Russia and internationally. He is most well known for his work on hallucinations, rethinking and changing the term he used to describe his experiences from true hallucinations to pseudo-hallucinations, after being haunted by the image of a hussar with a dark moustache, in a blue jacket and crimson trousers. The hussar would appear in his room, then be on a horse, then be in front of him in an imaginary theatre. It differed from other hallucinations. He was able to distinguish the pattern on his uniform and every curl of his hair in incredible detail, but the image of the hussar did not obscure the objects in the room. As soon as he entered, it was immediately clear that he was not real. He was a pseudo-hallucination. As well as his work on psychopathology, Kandinsky made a major contribution to the classification of mental disorders, and his expanded diagnostic system continued to be used in Russia for many years. He introduced the concept of idiophrenia to denote a disorder of perception and thinking long before the term schizophrenia was coined 20 years later. In some countries, Kandinsky's name is attached alongside that of Gaëtan de Clérambault, a French psychiatrist and photographer, to a particular cluster of psychotic symptoms often found in schizophrenia. The Kandinsky-Clérambault syndrome, or syndrome of psychic automatism, consists of hallucinations, delusions of being controlled in your movements, speech and thoughts, delusions of having your thoughts broadcast or thoughts inserted into your mind by an external force. He also contributed to the development of forensic psychiatry. The standard view on criminal responsibility in Russia at the time was that any patient suffering from any mental illness was not responsible for what he was doing. In his monograph on irresponsibility, published posthumously, Kandinsky argued against this general and undifferentiated approach, suggesting that every case should be examined individually according to the specific diagnosis and clinical state at the time the crime was committed. He described a number of cases of people accused of murder or murderous assaults who were admitted to hospital for assessment, including a man he concluded was malingering. In 1889, his mental state deteriorated again. He became depressed, and fearing that this was the start of another episode of psychosis, he took an overdose of opium and settled down to read The Cossacks by Leo Tolstoy. His last words, recorded in his journal, are, "It is becoming difficult for me to read." He was just 40 years old. Following his death, his wife collected his scientific writings together and posthumously published them. Unable to live without him, she then took her own life as well. This happened at the same dasha and in the same way on the anniversary of her husband's death. She was buried next to him at the Shuvalovskoye Cemetery in St. Petersburg. They left no children as they decided that people with mental illness were not entitled to have families. I will leave you with an extract from his obituary. Having an independent character and being completely devoted to scientific interests, he was an original thinker, and his early death at the age of 40 is a great loss to the psychiatric world. Victor Kandinsky was from a family of celebrated artists, musicians, writers, and like himself, people with mental illness, highlighting once again the close link between creativity and madness. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, there are many other topics on my channel, Professor Graeme Yorston's Insane History. And if this is your kind of thing, please subscribe and click the notifications bell to be alerted to new videos as they're released. See you again soon.